Mr. President, I rise in strong support of S-754, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. I want to thank my colleagues, Senator Burr and Vice Chairwoman Feinstein, for their leadership on this critically important legislation. This bill, of which I am originally co-sponsor, was overwhelmingly approved by a 14-to-1 vote in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in March. Enacting legislation to confront the accumulating dangers of cyber threats must be among the highest national security priorities of the Congress. Cyber attacks on our nation have become disturbingly common. More recently, it was the Office of Personnel Management. A few weeks before that, it was the Pentagon Network, the White House, and the State Department. Before that, it was Anthem and Sony, just to name a few. The status quo is unacceptable, and Congress needs to do its part in passing this legislation. But the President, as our nation's Commander-in-Chief, must also do his part to deter the belligerence of our adversaries in cyberspace. The threats from China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, not to mention the aspirations of terrorist organizations like ISIL and al-Qaeda, are steadily growing in number and severity. And our national security leadership has warned us repeatedly that we could face a cyber attack against our nation's critical infrastructure in the not-too-distant future. I believe our response to such an attack, or lack thereof, could define the future of warfare. To date, the U.S. response to cyber attacks has been tepid at best and non-existent at worst. Unless and until the President uses the authorities he has to deter, defend, and respond to the growing number of severity of cyber attacks, we will risk not just one more of the same, but embolden adversaries and terrorist organizations that will continuously pursue more severe and destructive cyber attacks. As Admiral Mike Rogers, the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, told listeners at the Aspen Security Forum a couple weeks ago, quote, "To date, there is little price to pay for engaging in some pretty aggressive behaviors." According to James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, quote, "We will see a progression or expansion of that envelope until such time as we create both a substance and psychology of deterrence. And today, we don't have that." According to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, our military enjoys, quote, "a significant military advantage in every domain except for one, cyberspace. As General Dempsey said, cyber is a level playing field, and that makes this chairman very uncomfortable," unquote. Efforts are currently underway to begin addressing some of our strategic shortfalls in cyberspace, including the training of a 6,200-person cyber force. However, these efforts will be meaningless unless we make the tough policy decisions to establish meaningful cyber deterrence. The President must take steps now to demonstrate to our adversaries that the United States takes cyber attacks seriously and is prepared to respond. This legislation before us is one piece of that overall deterrent strategy, and it's long past due time that Congress move forward on information sharing legislation. The voluntary information sharing framework in this legislation is critical to addressing these threats and ensuring that the mechanisms are in place to identify those responsible for costly and crippling cyber attacks and ultimately deter future attacks. Many of us have spent countless hours crafting and debating cyber legislation back to 2012. In 2012 was the last time we attempted to pass major cyber legislation. This body has come a long way since that time. We understand that we cannot improve our cyber posture by shackling the private sector, which operates the majority of our country's critical infrastructure, with government mandates. As I argued at that time, heavy-handed regulations and government bureaucracy will do more harm than good in cyberspace. The voluntary framework in this legislation represents the progress we have made in defining the role of the private sector and the role of the government in sharing threat information, defending networks, and deterring cyber attacks. This legislation also complements actions we've taken in the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, currently in conference with the House. As chairman of the Armed Services Committee, cybersecurity is one of my top priorities. That's why the NDAA includes a number of critical cyber provisions designed to ensure the Department of Defense has the capabilities it needs to deter aggression, defend our national security interests, and when called upon, defeat our adversaries in cyberspace. The NDAA authorizes the Secretary of Defense to develop, prepare, coordinate, and when authorized by the President, conduct a military cyber operation in response to malicious cyber activities carried out against the United States or a United States person by a foreign power. The NDAA also authorizes $200 million for the Secretary of Defense to assess the cyber vulnerabilities of every major DoD weapon system. Finally, Congress required the Congress to submit an integrated policy to deter adversaries in cyberspace in the fiscal year 2014 NDAA. We're still waiting on that policy, and this year's NDAA includes funding restrictions that will remain in place until it's delivered. Every day that goes by, I fear our nation grows more vulnerable. Our privacy and security are at greater risk, and our adversaries are further emboldened. These are the stakes, and that's why it's essential that we come together and pass the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act.